The judge called security. The lawyers laughed. A black teenager in a hoodie had just walked into court, claiming to be an attorney in a $2 million fraud case. Everyone thought it was a joke, until he pulled out a signed court order and exposed a millionaire's entire scam, live, in front of the world. Security. The word hit the air like a gavel crack, sharp and jarring. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as every eye turned toward the commotion. A young black teenager stood at the plaintiff's table, calm, composed, and completely out of place by all traditional appearances. He wore a gray hoodie pulled over a crisp suit, and in his hand, he clutched a worn leather briefcase that looked older than he was. People whispered. Some chuckled under their breath. Others stared in disbelief. Judge Holbrook, stern, aging, and well-known for his intolerance for nonsense, peered over his glasses, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. He was a no-nonsense, by-the-book man who didn't entertain delays or theatrics. And to him, this was both. "This isn't a school field trip, young man," he said dryly. "Are you lost, son?" There was no warmth in his voice, just cold authority laced with condescension. But the teen didn't flinch. "No, Your Honor," he replied, voice steady and respectful. "My name is Jordan Mendez. I'm a licensed attorney. I'm here to represent the plaintiff in this case." You could hear a pin drop for half a second. Then came the snickers. One of the defense attorneys nearly choked on his coffee. Another leaned over and whispered, "Is this some kind of stunt? A prank for YouTube?" A few people in the back row laughed outright. Even the bailiff, a stocky man with a thick mustache, looked hesitant, one foot stepping forward as if to escort the boy out, then pausing as confusion set in. But Jordan remained poised. He reached into his weathered briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. From it, he removed a court order, stamped, sealed, and signed by the State Bar Association. He held it up with confidence. "I passed the bar under a special legal prodigy program," he said clearly, turning to hand the document to the bailiff. "All my credentials are verified and current. Shall we proceed, Your Honor?" The murmurs faded. The room was now dead silent. Judge Holbrook adjusted his glasses, studying the document. The official seal glinted under the courtroom lights. He looked up slowly, scanning Jordan's face, not with amusement now, but with disbelief. The judge opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and glanced toward the defense table. Leonard Graham, the smug CEO being sued for corporate fraud, was staring in utter disbelief. His team of gray-suited attorneys whispered frantically, finally taking Jordan seriously, but only just. "This is a $2 million case," Judge Holbrook finally muttered, still frowning. "And you're telling me a teenager is here to argue it?" "Yes, sir," Jordan replied without hesitation. "I've reviewed every document, every piece of evidence. I'm prepared." The judge's expression twisted into something between skepticism and curiosity. He'd seen plenty of courtroom antics before, but this was something new. "Fine," he said slowly. "Let's see what you've got, Mr. Mendez." Jordan nodded, taking his seat with the composure of a seasoned litigator. He opened his briefcase and began arranging files with quiet efficiency. No theatrics, no posturing, just business. In the gallery, someone whispered, "That kid's got guts." But guts weren't the only thing Jordan had. What most people in that courtroom didn't know was that Jordan had spent nearly his entire life inside courthouses, not as a lawyer's son or a law student, but as the kid quietly sitting in the back while his mother, a janitor, scrubbed the floors at night. While other kids played video games, Jordan studied court transcripts. While teens hung out after school, he sat in on live trials. And while most people laughed at the idea of a kid lawyer, he was already outscoring seasoned attorneys in legal simulations by the time he was 15. Now, at 17, he was here. Not because someone handed him a break, but because he earned it. The courtroom didn't know what was coming, but Jordan did. Because every time someone told him he didn't belong, he worked twice as hard to prove them wrong. And today, standing in front of a judge who mocked him, lawyers who underestimated him, and a multi-million-dollar fraud case hanging in the balance, Jordan Mendez was ready to deliver the truth. He wasn't lost. He was exactly where he was meant to be. Judge Holbrook leaned back in his chair, lips tight, as if trying to decide whether this was a waste of his time or the start of a very strange day. "This is a $2 million corporate fraud case," he finally said, drawing out the words slowly, clearly emphasizing the gravity of the situation. "You sure you can handle this, Mr. Mendez?" He said it like a challenge. Like he expected the boy to blink, stutter, maybe even backpedal. But Jordan Mendez didn't flinch. "Yes, sir," he replied, looking the judge straight in the eye. "I'm ready to proceed." The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs. Even now, with his credentials verified, many still didn't believe he belonged there. At the defense table, Leonard Graham, the tech CEO with a sparkling watch and smug grin, sat back in his chair like a man already celebrating a win. He nudged his lead counsel, a gray-haired lawyer named Patrick Holmes, who hadn't even bothered to open his laptop. What most people in that courtroom didn't know was that Jordan had spent nearly his entire life inside courthouses, not as a lawyer's son or a law student, but as the kid quietly sitting in the back while his mother, a janitor, scrubbed the floors at night. While other kids played video games, Jordan studied court transcripts. While teens hung out after school, he sat in on live trials. And while most people laughed at the idea of a kid lawyer, he was already outscoring seasoned attorneys in legal simulations by the time he was 15. Now, at 17, he was here. Not because someone handed him a break, but because he earned it. The courtroom didn't know what was coming, but Jordan did. Because every time someone told him he didn't belong, he worked twice as hard to prove them wrong. And today, standing in front of a judge who mocked him, lawyers who underestimated him, and a multi-million-dollar fraud case hanging in the balance, Jordan Mendez was ready to deliver the truth. He wasn't lost. He was exactly where he was meant to be. Judge Holbrook leaned back in his chair, lips tight, as if trying to decide whether this was a waste of his time or the start of a very strange day. "This is a $2 million corporate fraud case," he finally said, drawing out the words slowly, clearly emphasizing the gravity of the situation. "You sure you can handle this, Mr. Mendez?" He said it like a challenge, like he expected the boy to blink, stutter, maybe even backpedal. But Jordan Mendez didn't flinch. "Yes, sir," he replied, looking the judge straight in the eye. "I'm ready to proceed." The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs. Even now, with his credentials verified, many still didn't believe he belonged there. At the defense table, Leonard Graham, the tech CEO with a sparkling watch and smug grin, sat back in his chair like a man already celebrating a win. He nudged his lead counsel, a gray-haired lawyer named Patrick Holmes, who hadn't even bothered to open his laptop. "Relax," Leonard whispered, loud enough for Jordan to hear. "We'll be out of here by lunch." Jordan heard it, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stood, calmly placed a stack of papers on the presentation screen, and began. "Your Honor, if it pleases the court, I'd like to begin with a timeline of Mr. Graham's financial transactions over the last 18 months. Click. A digital screen lit up. On it, charts, dates, amounts, organized, color-coded, and thoroughly sourced. Jordan spoke clearly, every word chosen with precision. He walked the court through emails between Mr. Graham and shell corporations, wire transfers labeled as donations, and suspicious withdrawals made just days before the nonprofit's bankruptcy filing. It didn't take long for the smirks to start fading. By the time Jordan pointed to a contract with a glaring inconsistency, a signature dated before the agreement had even been finalized, Holmes was finally opening his laptop. The other defense attorneys were suddenly scribbling notes. Judge Holbrook leaned forward, squinting at the screen. "Where did you get this document?" "Public filing, Your Honor," Jordan replied. "But I also subpoenaed the original from the nonprofit's board chair. You'll see her deposition in tab 4 of my binder." He handed the court clerk a copy, clean and neatly labeled. The courtroom had gone quiet again. This time, no one was laughing. Holmes stood up, trying to regain control. "Objection, Your Honor. This document wasn't disclosed in pretrial discovery." Jordan didn't hesitate. "I filed it 2 weeks ago." The defense acknowledged receipt in their amended discovery reply. Page 6, paragraph 3. Holmes' face turned a shade paler as he flipped through a folder. Judge Holbrook raised an eyebrow, glancing down at the paperwork. "Mr. Mendez is correct. Objection overruled." That was the moment the shift happened. People who had dismissed him were now leaning forward. Even the jury, many of whom had looked skeptical when they saw a teenager at the plaintiff's table, were suddenly taking notes, paying close attention. Jordan moved to the next slide. "Your Honor, I'd now like to address a document recently submitted by the defense, Exhibit 22. A donation receipt allegedly signed by Mr. Graham to prove his transparency." Judge Holbrook nodded, gesturing for him to proceed. Jordan pulled out the original document and a forensic report. With the help of a document analysis expert, I was able to detect alterations in this file. Specifically, the metadata indicates it was created using Adobe Acrobat Pro, but edited 5 days later using a different software, DocForge, which is often used for altering PDFs. Holmes jumped again. Objection. This is conjecture. Overruled, Judge Holbrook said almost immediately. He provided the expert report. Continue, Mr. Mendez. Jordan didn't even look satisfied. He was focused, surgical in his delivery. He went on to explain the signature's inconsistent alignment, the mismatched font sizes, and the strange spacing, all red flags. One slide even showed a magnified view where a portion of the document had been digitally cloned to cover another date. A gasp escaped from someone in the back row. Judge Holbrook stared at the screen, then slowly turned to look at Leonard Graham. The CEO was no longer smiling. Jordan walked back to the table and calmly closed his briefcase. I rest this portion of my argument, Your Honor, but I'll be calling 2 witnesses after lunch to confirm what the documents have already told us. Holbrook didn't respond right away. For the first time, he looked at Jordan not as a child in the wrong room, but as an attorney, a formidable one. All right, the judge said slowly. We'll recess until 1 p.m. Court is adjourned for lunch. The gavel hit the block, and as the courtroom began to clear, one thing became crystal clear. Jordan Mendez wasn't there to be impressive. He was there to win. When court reconvened after lunch, the mood in the courtroom had completely shifted. Earlier, Jordan Mendez had been seen as a novelty, maybe even a mistake. But now, he was a threat, a serious one. Gone were the smirks. Gone was the laughter. Leonard Graham sat stiff in his chair, no longer whispering to his attorneys. Even Judge Holbrook sat a little straighter, pen in hand, watching Jordan with a mix of caution and curiosity. But Jordan? He remained calm, focused. Because to him, this was never about being the center of attention or proving something to strangers. This case was personal. What no one in that courtroom knew, not the judge, not the jury, not even the reporters waiting outside, was that Jordan had spent more hours inside courthouses than most law school graduates. But not in a suit. In silence. He was the quiet black kid who used to sit in the back rows while his mother, Maria Mendez, scrubbed floors late into the night. She was a janitor, underpaid, overworked, but proud. Every evening, she brought him to work, a backpack filled with library books and legal pads. Sit where the lawyers sit, me, Joe, she'd whisper, pointing to the empty benches. And imagine yourself there one day. And he did. Night after night, he'd sit quietly while echoes of justice danced through the air, cross-examinations, objections, closing arguments. He absorbed it all like oxygen. He watched how the wealthy walked through those halls like they owned them. He watched how people like his mother were invisible, how they stepped aside, heads down, just to avoid being seen as in the way. Jordan never forgot it. He studied harder than anyone, skipped grades, took pre-law courses before he had a driver's license. He passed the bar under a legal prodigy program at just 17, making headlines in academic circles, but little public attention. And he preferred it that way. Because Jordan didn't just want to be a lawyer. He wanted to be the type of lawyer they said kids like him could never be. Back in the courtroom, Jordan called his first witness to the stand. Mrs. Evelyn Mathers, the former treasurer of the nonprofit Leonard Graham had allegedly defrauded. She was a soft-spoken woman in her 60s, hands trembling as she adjusted the microphone. Mrs. Mathers, Jordan began gently, can you confirm that Mr. Graham asked you to reroute donation funds to a third-party account last spring? Yes, she replied, nervously. He told me it was for a new tech initiative. But later I found out that account was connected to a yacht leasing company. Jordan nodded and slid a document across the table. Is this your email conversation with Mr. Graham from April 14th? She read it, then looked up and said firmly, yes. That's it. Holmes objected, but Judge Holbrook waved it off with barely a word. At this point, even the judge seemed to be more interested in hearing Jordan than stopping him. Jordan moved quickly, efficiently. He brought out one document after another, connecting the dots between fake consulting firms, hush payments, and personal purchases, including one company registered under the name of Leonard Graham's dog. Yes, his dog. Just to clarify, Jordan said, addressing the jury with calm confidence, your client laundered donations meant for underserved communities through a company named Barkwell Solutions LLC. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread across the room. Leonard's jaw clenched. His attorneys looked like they wanted to melt into their chairs. Judge Holbrook blinked, then looked down at the documents. His silence said more than words. But Jordan wasn't done. As the second witness prepared to take the stand, he paused and looked around the room. His voice softened, but somehow got even more powerful. Your Honor, before I continue, I'd like to say something. Judge Holbrook gave a nod. Jordan turned toward the jury. I know what I look like. I know what you all thought when I walked in here. Hoodie, black kid, young. You saw a student, maybe even a joke. But I'm not here because I got lucky. I'm here because my mom worked nights cleaning places like this, and I worked beside her, dreaming of standing here, not in the back row. He paused. I'm not here to impress you. I'm here for the truth. For the people that money was stolen from. For every kid who was told they weren't good enough to be in this room. Silence fell like a curtain. Even the court reporters stopped typing. Because Jordan wasn't just winning a case. He was rewriting the story of who gets to win it all. By the time Jordan Mendez began his closing argument, the courtroom felt like a completely different world than the one he had walked into that morning. Earlier, Judge Holbrook had mocked him. The lawyers had laughed. The jury had looked at him with pity or skepticism. But now, they listened. They leaned in. Even the court stenographer, who had typed thousands of legal proceedings in her lifetime, was watching Jordan with open curiosity, like she was witnessing something history might remember. Judge Holbrook leaned slightly forward in his chair, elbows on the bench, hands clasped in front of him. He didn't interrupt. Not once. He didn't raise an eyebrow, nor did he smirk the way he had earlier. Because now, he was actually listening. Jordan stood tall behind the plaintiff's table, his voice calm and strong as it echoed through the silent courtroom. This case, he began, has never just been about numbers, or missing funds, or fraudulent signatures. It's about accountability. It's about the belief that wealth and power don't place someone above the law. He turned and made eye contact with the jurors, one by one. Mr. Graham assumed that no one would look too closely, that a few shell companies and manipulated files would keep the truth buried, that no one would connect the dots. And, maybe, he even assumed that if someone did call him out, it wouldn't matter, because he had lawyers, resources, and influence. He paused. His next words hit like a pin dropping in silence. But he didn't count on me. Jordan took a small breath, letting the words sink in. Because I don't come from money. I come from someone who cleaned offices like this one at night so I could study during the day. I've spent my whole life watching people like Mr. Graham get away with things because no one challenged them. Because the people who could fight back didn't look like me, didn't believe in me, or didn't have the chance. Judge Holbrook sat back, arms now crossed, but his face had changed. His brow furrowed, not with skepticism, but with reflection. Jordan stepped forward. I stand here today not just to defend my client, he said, but to prove something bigger. That justice doesn't care how old you are, what color your skin is, or where you come from. It cares about truth. He turned to the judge. And sometimes, Your Honor, the truth walks in wearing a hoodie. Gasps. A few quiet chuckles. Not mocking this time, just stunned admiration. Jordan bowed his head slightly, then returned to his table and sat down, folding his hands calmly. There was a long pause. Judge Holbrook adjusted his glasses. He cleared his throat, but when he spoke, his voice was slower, quieter. Thank you, Mr. Mendez. Those 4 words hung in the air. For a man known for cutting down lawyers mid-sentence, known for his impatience with anything unorthodox or informal, that acknowledgement was practically a standing ovation. The defense team didn't speak. They barely moved. Leonard Graham sat frozen, pale, his usual smug grin nowhere in sight. Holmes, his attorney, looked like he'd aged 10 years in one afternoon. But the jury? They couldn't stop watching Jordan. Later, during the brief deliberation break, Judge Holbrook stayed in his chambers longer than usual. Not because he doubted the verdict. No, that part was clear. But because he was troubled. Troubled by how easily he had judged a young man by his clothes, by his age, by the color of his skin. He remembered his own words. Are you lost, son? And felt the sting of shame. Because Jordan wasn't lost. He was more prepared, more articulate, more focused than lawyers twice his age. He had dismantled a multi-million-dollar defense with facts, grace, and precision. He had done it without arrogance, without venom, just truth and courage. And the judge had nearly dismissed him. When the jury returned just 45 minutes later, there was no suspense in their body language. They were confident. The courtroom rose as Judge Holbrook re-entered. He looked different now, not in appearance, but in posture. Humbled, reflective. He took his seat, glanced once more at Jordan, and nodded. Has the jury reached a verdict? A juror stood. Yes, Your Honor. We find in favor of the plaintiff. Damages awarded. $2 million plus legal costs. Leonard's mouth dropped open. His lawyers didn't move. And Jordan? He didn't smile. Didn't cheer. He simply nodded and started packing his files. But before he could leave, Judge Holbrook stood. I'd like to say something before we adjourn. Jordan looked up, briefcase halfway closed. The entire courtroom fell silent again. Judge Holbrook removed his glasses, his voice slower now. Warmer. I misjudged you, Mr. Mendez. I mocked you. I doubted you. But what I saw today was brilliance, professionalism, and a lesson I, for one, needed to learn. There was a pause. Then, slowly, people began to stand. A quiet, respectful applause broke out, building into something undeniable. Jordan stood still, quietly receiving it. Because he knew. He didn't need the applause. He had earned the respect. All rise. The courtroom stood as Judge Holbrook re-entered, but this time, the atmosphere was reverent, solemn, almost like a ceremony. Not because of the verdict, which most people already suspected, but because of what had just taken place. A teenager had walked into that courtroom a target of ridicule and turned it into his arena. Judge Holbrook, now visibly moved, sat down and adjusted his robes with care. The jury finds in favor of the plaintiff, he said clearly. Damages awarded. $2 million plus legal costs. Leonard Graham let out a stunned breath. He slumped in his chair like air had been punched out of him. His once cocky team sat frozen. No rebuttals. No objections. Just disbelief. Jordan Mendez didn't celebrate. He simply nodded once, calmly, and began packing his files into his worn leather briefcase. The same one people had snickered at earlier that morning. He tucked his folders into it with care, as if this were any other day. But the room knew. This was not just another day. Before anyone could move, Judge Holbrook cleared his throat and stood. I want to say something before this court is adjourned, he said, removing his glasses slowly, almost ceremonially. And I hope the reporters in the back have their pens ready, because this needs to be said, clearly. Everyone turned toward the bench. Even Jordan paused. Judge Holbrook looked down at him, not from a place of superiority anymore, but from a place of respect. Mr. Mendez, the judge began, when you walked into this courtroom, I did not see an attorney. I saw a child. I saw a hoodie. I saw someone who didn't belong. He let that hang in the air. Some in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. And I was wrong, he continued. Dead wrong. I mocked you. I doubted your credentials. I doubted your mind. But what I saw here today was more than just competence. It was brilliance. It was courage. It was justice in its truest form. Jordan said nothing. He just stood still, hands resting on his briefcase, eyes locked with the judge. Holbrook's voice softened. You didn't just win a case, Mr. Mendez. You challenged this system, a system that often assumes brilliance wears gray suits and has white hair. You reminded us that the law should not be measured by appearance, but by action, preparation, and heart. A wave of silence passed over the room again, thicker, heavier, more meaningful than before. The judge nodded once more. This court is adjourned. Bang. The gavel fell. But no one moved. Until someone in the gallery, an older black man in a crisp vest, stood and began to clap. Just once. Then again. Then another person joined in. And another. And another. In seconds, the entire courtroom was on its feet. Not clapping for the judge. Not for the jury. But for Jordan. It wasn't loud and rowdy. It was dignified. Emotional. A release of something that had built up all day long. A standing ovation, not for a win, but for what it represented. A barrier had been broken. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed. Cameras flashed. Microphones extended from every angle. Jordan, how does it feel to have just taken down a millionaire at 17? One reporter shouted. Were you nervous up there? Is it true your mom used to clean that very courtroom? Jordan smiled softly, shielding his eyes from the flashing lights. I wasn't nervous, he said, because I wasn't there alone. I carried my mom with me. My community. Every kid who's been told they don't belong in rooms like that. Another reporter stepped forward. How did you stay so calm in the face of so much disrespect? Jordan paused. Then he said, because they didn't see me coming. And sometimes, that's our greatest advantage. The cameras caught every word. And just like that, the boy who had once sat in the back row watching court proceedings while his mother mopped the floors walked down those same courthouse steps as a national headline, a hero, a symbol of something bigger than himself. Not just a genius, not just a lawyer, but proof. Proof that brilliance has no age, that strength has no color, and that sometimes the system gets reminded who justice is really for. Jordan Mendez disappeared into the crowd not as a prodigy, not as a novelty, but as a force. And the world would never underestimate him again.